Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming out today. My name is Randy Bell. I'm the Managing Director here at the ISS-US. We're pleased to have Professor Geoffrey Till here with us today. He's going to speak about his new book, Asia's Naval Expansion. And one quick announcement, the book is so popular that we've actually sold out of all of our copies, which is unusual for these books. There are more on their way. It should be here by the time this program is done. So we hope that you enjoy his talk and will purchase one of the books. Professor Till is now the Professor of Maritime Studies and the Director of the Corbett Center for Maritime Policy Studies. That's at King's College in London, correct?
Yep.
And formerly, he was, he's been basically everywhere, working on naval issues. Let's see, I have a huge bio here. I'm going to pick the highlights. Visiting scholar at the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey. He was the Foundation Chair in Military Affairs at U.S. Marine Corps University in Quantico, Virginia. He was a Senior Research Fellow at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore, and they're a partner with our Singapore office. So we're very glad that you're involved with our office in many different ways. And I assume that this book was started when you were over there working in Singapore.
Right,
and you have a good connection with the Singapore office.
Indeed.
ISS, for those who don't know, has an office in Singapore, in Manama, Bahrain, here, and then our headquarters are in London. Jeff Till is going to talk for 20 or 30 minutes about the book, and then we'll open it up to questions. So without any further ado.
Thanks very much. Is this on? Yes. Okay, well, the sub-theme and the subtitle of this book is An Arms Race in the Making, ? And that's pretty much the subject of my talk, and really the subject of this book, is what is happening in the Asia-Pacific and naval arms race. Arms races, both naval and otherwise, have a very bad press. They're usually regarded as both a military expression and a military consequence of the existing state of international relations. But they can also develop a momentum of their own. They waste money. They can exacerbate already tense relations between states, and they can threaten to destabilize whole regions. All too often they seem to make conflict more likely. Instead of reflecting policy, as Clausewitz reminds us the military should do, arms races determine it. So the set of questions to be looked at is whether what is happening to the navies of the Asia-Pacific is best seen as a cause or a consequence of shifting developments in the region, and whether it has the potential to destabilize things. And that is my theme. But first of all, the easy question: what is happening out there? Some people fear, as I said, that a naval arms race is indeed developing, and they lament its possible consequences. It's not hard to see why they should think that. Whether it's Malaysia's Scorpion submarines, Vietnam's kilos, India's unprecedented naval building program, or China's new carrier and its carrier-killing ballistic missiles, naval modernization across the region is producing, if not always an overall increase in numbers, then at least substantially more impressive offensive and defensive naval capabilities. If you take the US out of the equation, in this current decade, Asia will outspend the Old West on navies for the first time in perhaps 400 years. Nothing could better illustrate the shifts in the world's strategic architecture than that simple fact. But more important, though, is what lies behind these acquisitions. Why are they building what they're building? The worrying thing is that it might well be associated with a range of sometimes quite narrowly focused strategic maritime tensions, with analysts almost everywhere really, but especially in the Asia-Pacific, especially debating the dismayingly specific competition between China's counter-intervention strategies and capabilities and the US air-sea battle construct. So to what extent are such strategic conceptions driving naval development in these two countries? The more they are, the more likely an action-reaction dynamic leading to a naval arms race, deteriorating relations, international instability will follow. At first glance, the prospect of Vietnam's kilos becoming fully operational can be seen as a more limited version of the same kind of A2AD construct, even if they are fundamentally to be deployed against a different target. Japan-China naval development could also be seen as another example of action-reaction dynamics between two countries with historical antipathies. Both examples suggest a worsening competition between offensive and defensive capabilities. The recent sinking of the South Korean corvette Shonan is another particularly worrying example of the dangers of increasing levels of strategic competition. And all of this, of course, is coinciding with, even produced by, rising maritime tensions in the East and South China Seas, complicated areas of dispute attracting ever more attention because of their resources and the strategic access they provide. This is particularly worrying because for economic and strategic reasons, the maritime domain in the Asia-Pacific region is critical. But is this a real arms race? Well, is it like the naval arms race that developed between Britain and Germany before the First World War over dreadnoughts? And will it have the same consequences? Even if it is a naval arms race, how seriously should we take its consequences to be? Of course, the answer partly depends on what you mean by naval arms race. Many would take the dreadnought arms race as a kind of exemplar of what naval arms races are and what they can do, particularly in the period 1909-1912. Although it didn't precipitate the war in 1914, as things turned out, that naval arms race poisoned the atmosphere and crucially meant that Britain and Germany would be on opposite sides. So what was it like? Well, that one reflected an intensely competitive international environment with strong levels of bilateral rivalry, which eventually coalesced into two rival coalitions. It was technologically very intense in terms of both quality and quantity. The dreadnought battleship was a completely transformational bit of kit that rendered previous battleships obsolete overnight. It was feared with some justice that the military advantage of having more of them, or better ships in terms of armour, guns and speed, could be militarily decisive. The pace of technological change, in other words, was frighteningly rapid. The battlecruiser Invincible, for example, was commissioned with great fanfare in 1909, but near obsolescence when sunk in 1916, a bare 7 years later. The build-up was also geographically focused. German ships were specifically designed for operations in the North Sea. And who else could the Kaiser have had in mind for Britain? And the stakes seemed very high. That's Lord Grey, the Foreign Secretary. If we alone, among the great powers, gave up the competition and sank into a position of inferiority, he said, what good would we do? None whatever. We should cease to count for anything amongst the nations of Europe, and we should be fortunate if our liberty was left and we did not become the conscript appendage of some stronger power. Unsurprisingly then, the great powers spent nearly half their budgets on defence and justified it explicitly on the need to keep up with, or in Britain's case, ahead of, their rivals in the race. And before the First World War, many people warned specifically of the consequences of this, not just for peace but also for economic prosperity. Others, on the other hand, used the existence of a naval arms race as a public justification for their naval plans. Either way, critics and supporters, if you like, accepted that a crucial naval arms race was in progress. So if that's the measure of whether a naval arms race, to what extent can we see this evident in the Asia-Pacific region? I would broadly argue not very many. There are some very major differences, it seems to me, between pre-war Europe and the situation now in the Asia-Pacific. Most obviously, if with some exceptions, China, Singapore, India, the countries of the region are devoting a far smaller proportion of their national treasure to defence than did Britain and Germany in 1914. So in terms of effort, financial effort and investment, it's generally speaking much lower. I would argue that in general, the rate of technical advance in naval armaments is much slower than it was then, with acquisition programs around the area being more incremental, more deliberate, less determined by transformational technology. Technological change now seems to me to be much steadier, and the rewards of being ahead, in quotes, more debatable, given the asymmetric technological, political, legal alternatives and responses that others can come up with. Crucially, very few national leaders, diplomats or even sailors talk in naval arms race terms like they did then, and they certainly, in public at least, do not use the argument about the need to get ahead as a justification for their efforts and their plans. On the contrary, in public at any rate, they make every effort to avoid identifying possible adversaries that they need to build against. Pundits and the enraged netizen might do that, but as a rule, policymakers don't, at least not in public. Nor was there in the period before the First World War the kind of compensating collaborative institutional arrangements that draw nations together rather than drive them apart. For all its limitations, the Asian way, increasing levels of economic interdependence, transnational regional structures like ASEAN do limit the habits of competition. Regional navies therefore cooperate with one another against common threats such as maritime crime in its various forms, piracy, drugs, people smuggling and so forth. Look at the success of the Malacca Straits patrol arrangements, for example. Local navies engage in innumerable bilateral and multilateral exercises, and they operate side by side in dealing with humanitarian and civil disasters, like the tsunami relief operation of 2004. This leads on to an important point. What matters when one looks at naval expansion is less the fact of naval acquisition and more on the thought that lies behind it. And this kind of more nuanced question is less simply concentrated on the simple question of what they've got, and more on what they seem likely actually to do with it. And this focuses attention on roles and missions. And I would argue that there are a whole lot of naval missions, especially in the Asia-Pacific region, which do proceed from a collaborative, cooperative set of policy assumptions, rather than the intensely competitive ones that dominated the scene in Europe before the First World War. They include things like participation in combined expeditionary operations, supported by large swathes of the world community, cooperative activity to ensure maritime security and humanitarian operations, cooperative multinational exercises, exchanges, etc. Now, of course, there were such acts in pre-war Europe, but never to the extent of becoming a matter of routine, never dominating naval programs in the way that they do in the Asia-Pacific, and they never had the limiting effect on naval competition to be seen today. Much of the naval modernisation process, indeed, looks like the perfectly normal behaviour of maritime powers in a profoundly maritime area, which have recently come into much greater national wealth and are looking to correct previous neglect and to defend legitimate maritime interests. I would point to the fact that the naval expansion program actually began back in the 80s and was actually derailed by the financial crisis of '97, more or less stopped, and started again in the early part of this century, once that particular financial crisis had been navigated safely through. And in many countries, what is being presented is not the development of maritime power for the first time, but if you like, its rediscovery. India, China, and to a surprising extent the countries of Southeast Asia hark back to a maritime past, which they are now in a position to revert to. So in a sense, it's kind of getting back to normal. Nor is the developing architecture anything like as bilateral as it was in Europe in 1914. Although there are certainly hotspots, like the two Koreas. There are cross-cutting influences wherever you look. There seems very little prospect of the region's international relationships degenerating bilaterally into one coalition against another, especially if one thinks of one coalition being led by China and the other one by the United States. Most countries in the region not only do not want to choose which of those two sides to join, they don't even want the question asked. And this was very different in the Europe before the First World War, where there was nothing the weaker sought more than a cast-iron security guarantee from a strong protector. Now, one needs to be careful. I've given a benign, sanguine version of what's happening in the Asia Pacific, and I think one does need, to an extent, to be careful. This is not to say that everything in the naval garden is rosy, for it certainly isn't. What's happening is not, at the moment, a naval arms race, but it's far from impossible that the naval modernisation process that we see taking place around the region could degenerate into one. Any day in the disputed East and South China Sea could easily generate a crisis that turns a mild competition in risk-taking into a full-blown international crisis at sea. For evidence of that, I would point, let's look at Southeast Asia, for example. All the countries there are investing now for the first time in submarines. Submarine development is difficult, it's demanding, it's expensive. It's an area in which submarine operation could be fairly hazardous. It could well be the victim of an accident, a submarine accident of some sort. The oil exploration rigs proliferating around the East and South China Sea, for example, could be collided with or something like that. So a submarine accident, an oil rig accident, which, to judge by events in more tranquil places elsewhere, could be the scene of a maritime disaster, could, in a disputed area of the South or East China Sea, be very difficult to handle, especially given the rising nationalist feeling that's evident in the social media. And sadly, this point about the prospect of accident, the prospect of something sparking off an adverse set of consequences that nobody really wanted in the first place, cannot be ruled out. And there is sadly a developing focus on specific sea areas, rather analogous in some ways to the North Sea in 1912, 1914, where the disputes are increasingly important both economically and strategically. And here again, one has to identify the South and East China Seas. Another problem is the near total lack of transparency about the true extent of individual naval acquisition programs around the region, not just China, everywhere else as well, to a greater or lesser extent, and even more about the intentions that lie behind them. These could easily generate worst-case analysis on the part of naval planners throughout the region. They don't know what the other side, if there is another side, is doing, so they have to assume the worst. And nor is this danger much moderated by institutionalised arms control and arms usage procedures. The complete failure, for example, to operationalise the 2002 Declaration of Conduct of parties to the South China Sea dispute after over 10 years, the paucity of real hotline arrangements between potentially competing naval powers, and the lack of incidents at sea agreements, and all illustrate that basic problem. There aren't the restraints, the institutionalized restraints that there were on naval development, even during, in some ways, the Cold War. And then perhaps most worryingly is the growth of the social media and the committed netizen, all too ready to give vent to nationalist sentiment over the latest spat, whatever it is, in the East and South China Seas. These whittle away at their own government's capacity to manoeuvre and their already often fragile ability to keep control of events. All too often, how a government does in protecting its island claims is seen as a kind of performance indicator of how well that government is doing. So, a modern version of the dreadnought fever that gripped Europe before the First World War isn't yet evident, but I think it would be a very brave analyst looking at the cyber sparring that attended things like the China-Philippine crisis over Scarborough Shoal last year, or the ramming incident that took place in the disputed islands in the East China Sea between a Chinese trawler and a Japanese Coast Guard vessel the year before, would rule that kind of thing out entirely. And in fact, most people would argue that it's gradually getting worse. For such reasons, sailors and diplomats in the Asia-Pacific region, it seems to many, should be continually alert to the risk that today's naval modernisation might just, despite their best intentions, turn into tomorrow's arms race. As a result, the military means might indeed eventually overwhelm the political ends. There are accordingly many who would argue that the short-term imperative then would be to ensure, or do what they can to ensure, that the naval modernisation process required to provide good order and stability at sea and the incentives for agreement is accompanied by increased acts of naval togetherness, policy transparency, and more effective ways of reducing operational risk when untoward events occur, as sadly they always will. The final issue, of course, is how much it would matter if a naval arms race did develop in the Asia-Pacific region. How much, in fact, would it destabilise things? I'll actually leave that issue on a slightly mischievous note. Bernard Brodie once famously argued that if anything, a naval arms race might have the very reverse effect. It might help stabilise international relations rather than destabilise them. A determined naval modernisation process might have a useful deterrent effect, provide incentives for friendship. Naval weakness, on the other hand, might offer up opportunities for the ambitious to misunderstand or even to exploit. Hence his warning that the policy of faith, hope and parity, as he called it, of the interwar period of the Western powers hardly ushered in an era of sunshine and world peace. And with that, I'll stop and hand over to you for what President Gorbachev in happy days used to call socialist criticism.
Thank you so much. I'm going to open up for questions now. I'll take the first question. One of my colleagues in London, who, to be fair, is a land warfare guy, so might be biased, has argued that the advent and expansion of precision-guided weapons is going to dramatically change the nature, the structure of navies. That the carrier-based navy, at least for the larger powers, will no longer be as relevant. Do you think that argument A might be true, and B, how will it impact developments in Asia?
Yes, and there is this continual argument. There always has been in the development of navies in the past that they're facing technological changes that are going to transform things. So far, none of them have, in the sense that the technology that produces a challenge, if you like, can nearly always be relied on to produce the answer to it. So naval operations, if you like, get another layer of activities that get folded into you end up pretty much in the same situation as you started in. Or at least you do, provided you stay in the race, if you like. But if it's neglected and the other side do develop a sort of technological lead, then obviously you're operating at a disadvantage. The usual case of, the usual argument, if you like, the radicals, is to say that even though this has often proved not to have been quite as transformational as people thought when they arrived as submarines, naval aircraft and so on and so forth, but this time it will. That we are facing this time something that's completely different, and it really is a challenge. And I think there are two forms of this kind of argument going around today. One is what you just mentioned. It's the rise of precision weapons, particularly fired from land, which could well reinforce the argument that what we should be seeing in naval development, and what, if it's true, we will be seeing in naval development, is a kind of diffusion of naval power into more smaller units. And the avoidance of big things like carriers, for example, which are seen as targets, if you like, essentially. And this is sometimes reinforced by advocates of network-enabled operations, and they say that diffused naval power around a larger number of smaller units, which are individually less important, if you like, become important because of the way they're linked together. And that this is a second type of technological transformation, that if countries aren't in the business of being able to link together their smaller units, then they'll be operating at severe disadvantage against countries that are. Hence Singapore's insistence on fourth generation, as they call them, network-enabled operations, which gives them, they think, a huge advantage over everybody else. So those two things put together do suggest, that a real possibility that would transform the nature of navies. It would make them less focused on a few big ships, more focused on lots of capable smaller ships. The two arguments against that. It's a complicated, it's a simple question, but it's a very difficult thing to answer. The first one is that it's simply not true. The sort of challenge of precision weaponry can be met by better defences of one form or another, and that the standard rule in the past has been the bigger the ship, the bigger the capacity, the more the ship resilience, if you like. I'm not a technical person, I won't push that any further. The second argument, in a way, is more interesting. It says that we shouldn't be wholly preoccupied with the prospect of high-intensity conflict between fleets in the old style. That what we're looking at is a sort of hierarchy of things that navies can do. At the top of the hierarchy is state-on-state peer competition, midway, all over again, sort of approach to naval operations. But that isn't, in fact, what navies spend most of their time doing, especially these days. They deal with lower intensity types of threat, types of activity in defence of national interest. And for that, there hardly is any doubt that the bigger the ship, the better. And that the old pattern of naval formations is very useful because, if you're going in to do humanitarian relief, the bigger the ship, the better, frankly. You've got crew to do whatever needs to be done. You've got lots of storage capacity you've got hospital facilities, all the rest of it. So what you need there is a big unit. So there are two sorts of answers to it. One simply says it's not true, and blah blah. And the second answer says that even if it was true, we'd still need the old stuff anyway.
Yeah. Thank you.
Very long answer, but
no. Interesting set of answers. If you can all say your affiliation and try to make your question a question, that would be great. Please. And we have a microphone coming.
Right. I'm Harlan Elman, a very former naval person. Jeff, thanks for very, very comprehensive and very useful put our eyes on that subject. An observation to put the cat amongst pigeons and then a question. Two game changers may in fact be cyber. If you will recall the book written by the Chinese colonels in 1999 on conventional war.
Yeah.
Take out GPS. And it's also interesting to remind people that the Battle of Okinawa, some 5,000 kamikazes flew, less than 4% hit their targets, the majority missed, supposing they were guided missiles, that had accuracy, and 20% yet, we probably would have lost the battle of Naval. My question is this: you talk about a naval arms race. Between who and whom? And perhaps it is the model to look at not so much 1909, but 1961, 62, the U.S. and Soviet navies, in which both used the other, even though they had fundamentally different views of war and the nature of war. But yet, during that period, we were able to agree to arms control and incidents at sea. You didn't mention the other Pacific power yet, namely Russia, potentially Pacific maritime power. How would you institute incidents at sea agreements, maybe on a bilateral basis or multilateral basis, and indeed try to impose some degree of naval cooperation, arms control, humanitarian partnerships, so that you inspire navies to work together? And as the Soviet and American navies demonstrated, that was really a very, very strong step towards détente and towards better understanding. How would you impose, or at least try to impose, such a regime as possible in the Pacific?
It's frequently argued that the Asia-Pacific scene would be considerably more stable if there were more incidents at sea agreement. I'm actually a bit sceptical about that. And the reason I'm sceptical is that the incidents at sea agreement is a specific model for moderating naval behaviour in close proximity. And I'm not sure that it's all that applicable, actually, to the, or even possible, in much of the Western Pacific, for various sets of reasons. The first one is that it is a Cold War model. It does take for granted, if you like, that there is a potential hostile partner, not partners, maybe, potentially hostile competitor whose activity needs to be restrained, and that, you know, this is a serious problem. It's kind of to admit in advance that there's a problem, if you see what I mean. More serious difficulty, I think, is the fact that the areas in which such an incident at sea agreement will be most valuable are precisely those areas in which there is dispute about whose sea it is and what's permissible in it. So you are very unlikely, really, to get China, for example, to agree to an incidents at sea agreement in areas of sea that China regards as its own. So for that reason, I would argue that what one really should be encouraging, instead of formal incidents at sea agreement like that, is the development, if you like, of standard navigational safety procedures. The sort of thing that's encouraged by the International Maritime Organization. It's basically observing the rule of the road. It's basically about not doing things that endanger life and all of those sorts of things. And there you've got a set of models that applies everywhere. It doesn't apply in particular areas of the sea, and it seems to me that encouraging the development of that sort of thing is really the way to go. Politically more possible, and it doesn't make the kind of assumptions about a potential hostility that in sea agreements do. So what I've got in mind really are things like queues, the code for unalerted encounters at sea, that the US and other countries, including China, have been talking about. That seems to me to be the route to go rather than formal incidents at sea agreement. I have to say, though, against my own argument, that Malaysia and Indonesia have signed recently an incidents at sea agreement, even though they do disagree about some of the sea areas. So it is possible. I just say it's more difficult to do.
And Russia?
Yes, I think the Russians would not have a substantial problem with that outside areas that are in dispute.
Well, my name is Tomoyuki Tono. I live in the Federal Center for International Security. Well, that microphone.
I think I'm going to make sure that.
Well, my name is Tomoyuki Tono. My name is Tomoyuki Tono. I visit in Kenowat Center for New American Security. I'd like to.
having some
technology.
technical
I
difficulties
rest
here.
my case on technology.
Speak loudly,
What to do
please. We'll try to get another mic. We have another mic from the back, but for now, speak loudly.
I'd like to ask you a question about offense-defense balance and stability and instability. Well, recently I have read a paper written by an active U.S. naval officer that says that carrier battle group is not really effective. Use of drones and precision cruise missiles will be more promising. So then my question is, apart from the U.S. battle groups, if the allied countries equip their vessels with drones or cruise missiles to support the U.S. naval posture, will become the situation more stable because a certain country that will restrain a certain country's behavior, or will it induce military buildup, competition, and the Asia-Pacific situation will be destabilized? This is my question.
Thank you. Yes, there are two things I think need to be said about this. The one is a general discussion about whether there is an offensive or defensive characteristic of any weapon system. In other words, is it something that's inherent in the nature of a weapon system as a technical development, or is it a matter of how you use that weapon system? And there are those who argue that there are some kinds of weapons, and for example, the two that you mentioned, that can be seen as inherently offensive rather than inherently defensive. And therefore, the more countries develop those particular types of weaponry, then the more likely it is that instability will be the result. I'm very sceptical of that argument. It seems to me that there isn't anything either offensive or defensive that's an inherent characteristic of a weapon system. It depends on how it's used. So let's look at the examples that you gave. Cruise missiles, for example. When one looks at the notional competition between air-sea battle on the one hand and counter-intervention operations on the other, one element of both concepts is land attack, preemptive land attack. In the Chinese case, analysts have talked about preemptive strikes on American air bases in Guam or Japan or whatever it is. In the US case, some analysts have talked in air-sea battle about preemptive strikes against sources of air power on the Chinese mainland. Now, it would seem to many people, including me, that the land attack element that's brought with the availability of cruise missiles would be hugely escalatory. It's very hard to conceive, I think it's very hard to conceive of a conflict in which either side initiated a land attack element in their conduct of operations that didn't very rapidly escalate into a full-scale war that nobody would wish for. So I wonder, to the extent that the concept makes sense as an operational strategy. It might make sense in terms of shadow boxing, but it doesn't make much sense in operational strategy for that sort of reason. And I think that's a reasonable argument to say effectively that that capability, if deployed and if used, would be inherently escalatory and destabilizing. And the more emphasis is given to it in peacetime, the greater, it seems to me, the prospect for nervousness, overreaction on the part of everybody else. So in that kind of way, that particular capability, if linked to an operational concept about how it will be used, could create exactly the kind of destabilizing relations that you're talking about.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think we're having serious technical difficulties today.
It's on.
Our low-tech weaponry.
No, it's not.
No.
Just speak loudly.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. My name is Dong Guiyu with China Naval News Agency of Hong Kong. How would you compare the naval capability among China, Japan, and India in the near term, mid-term, and long term? Yeah, because I know the new China military report released by the Pentagon pay a lot of attention to the Chinese naval capability. And will the build-up of Chinese Navy challenge the U.S. dominance in the West Pacific area in 10 or 20 years? Because I know also the Carnegie Endowment just released a report that the U.S. China's military build-up will challenge the U.S.-Japan alliance in like 15 or 20 years. What's your view about it?
That's the big question, of course, and that's the question that everybody, planners here, planners everywhere in the Asia-Pacific region want to know. Because on the assumptions about the answers that question produces, their planning assumptions would rest. It's speculative, it's future-oriented, and it's very difficult to tell. I think you sort of suggest I look at it in the short term, the medium term, and the long term. I think in terms of operational quality of the three navies that you mentioned, that is Japan, India, and China, in terms of its operational capability and the sophistication of its operations, I would argue that the Japanese Navy is currently in the lead. This is partly a function of experience, operational tempo, long periods of familiarization with operations, close association with the United States, etc., etc., etc. I think they do have a very effective navy. India is a very interesting case too, in the sense that they have a very long operational experience. They have far more experience than anyone else in the region of operating aircraft carriers, for example. They have good relations with Western countries, and also with they're bedeviled, though, by problems of bureaucratic inefficiency, an inability to spend their budgets, plans that actually often fail to materialise, and so on and so forth, and that's been their problem. The Chinese Navy is, if you like, in many ways, the new kid on the block, facing a very steep learning curve. I think if you look at the way that the Chinese Navy has learnt the lessons of long-distance deployments through the counter-piracy operation of Somalia, for example, it's been very impressive. It's been a steady learning curve on how you support naval operations at a long distance from home. And if you extrapolate from that, the learning curve that applies to, let's say, the operation of SSBNs, carrier operations, and so on and so forth, I think one can certainly see a rising trend of naval capability that at some stage or the other will overtake the other two. Arguably, it already has overtaken India, actually, but would even overtake Japan. So the operative question is how long and to what extent would this have an impact on the United States? I think to an extent the answer is a conceptual one as well as a technical one. If China focuses exclusively on, if you like, the defence, in quotes, of its near seas in the East and South China Sea, it would pose a serious risk is the wrong word, but a constraint on the freedom of operation of the US Navy in those particular areas. But it seems to me that this is likely, to some extent at any rate, to be countered by growth of Chinese interest in operations beyond the near seas, in which case they're going to have to develop the same kind of capabilities as the US Navy has got: aircraft carriers, replenishment vessels, amphibious warfare ships, all of these sorts of things that make sense for more distant operations. And in that case, their ability, if you like, to dominate the near seas might actually be reduced by the desire to actually go out further. And so that would pose a different kind of challenge. Arguably not a challenge. Arguably, it depends what the distant sea operations were intended to do. If they were China accepting a sort of role in the defence of the international system, for example, as many countries would wish it to do, then it wouldn't be a threat at all. That it would basically be nothing more significant than China's contribution to world stability. So it shouldn't necessarily be seen as a threat. But the other complication, of course, is where's the US Navy going? I'm very hesitant to say anything about that in the presence of people like Harlan and so on and so forth, but that depends very much on the fate of the US economy, political futures, future sequestration and so on and so forth. It's obviously going to be a more constrained future for the United States than it has been since the end of the Cold War.
A follow-on question to that. In the short term, has the U.S. rebalance affected the potential for a naval arms race? Does that play a role in the thinking in Asia, or?
I think it does, but for the wrong reasons. I think the fact that the rebalance has become associated in the public mind and the media mind with the air-sea battle, and where the focus is on the military aspects of the rebalance rather than everything else, rather than on the institutional rebalance, the economic rebalance, the political rebalance, which is all part of it, has had the effect, and I don't think I'm certain that it wasn't intended, nor do I think it's necessarily justified, but that has had the effect of making people think that it's become a more escalatory area, if you like, and therefore looking a bit more to the need to defend, not against it, but in the light of the fact that the atmosphere is getting rather more tense. I think it's a misrepresentation of what the rebalance is, but nonetheless, in certain countries this is the way it's seen. And their reactions to it and to the deteriorating atmosphere, shall I say, might lead others to say, well, if that's what they're doing, then we have to respond to that. So it is possible. So I think what's needed to counter that sort of prospect is more emphasis on all the other aspects of the rebalance as well, and also to make the case rather more clearly that the United States is not kind of returning to the Pacific. It's never not been there.
Yeah.
I mean, it's as much right to be there as anybody else. And that kind of argument, which I think has rather got lost sight of.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? Allie, have the books arrived yet? That's the pressing question I have. Have the books arrived yet?
They have arrived.
They have arrived. Fantastic. Well, if we have no more questions, I'd like to thank Jeff for giving a fantastic presentation on a pressing question that I know is often on the talked about here in Washington and around the world. And we'd like you to purchase his book as a way of saying thank you. And I think you'll find much more in that book. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks very much.
Just a great pleasure.
Well, my pleasure. Nice to see you.